I'm Peter Joseph. I've been aboard since 2011 when I joined, and I've been the group leader here in Marin County, California since that time. And we are very fortunate tonight to have our first speaker. I am now going to introduce Dr. Ben Santer. And because he is who he is, this is going to take a few minutes, and it's going to be fun. Dr. Santer's CV is 46 pages long as of several years ago. I suspect it's longer now. Uh, Dr. Santer received his Bachelor of Sciences from the University of East Anglia in the UK, followed by a Ph.D. in 1987 in climatology at the same institution. And he did his postdoctoral research at the Max Planck Institute for Meteorology in Hamburg, Germany, under Dr. Klaus Hasselmann, who was awarded the Nobel Prize in Physics in 2021 for his work on climate modeling, which is what Dr. Santer does. His main research has been the identification of human fingerprints uh, on the natural and human-caused climate signals in the observed climate records. He's currently professor in the School of Environmental Sciences at the University of East Anglia in the United Kingdom. Prior to that, he was for 30 years an atmospheric scientist at Lawrence Livermore National Laboratory in Livermore, California, where his employer was the United States Department of Energy. He was the lead convening author of the 1995 IPCC report, which found a discernible human influence on the climate. And this is when he first became the target of the denialist movement. And by the way, the IPCC, as you know, was awarded the 2007 Nobel Peace Prize, along with Al Gore, for its efforts to, quote, build up and disseminate greater knowledge about man-made climate change. Dr. Santer has received honors, awards, or memberships and positions from the American Geophysical Union, the American Meteorological Society, Lawrence Livermore National Laboratory, the U.S. Department of Energy, the National Academy of Sciences, California Institute of Technology, UCLA, the IPCC, where he contributed to 5 assessment reports, the MacArthur Foundation, the World Meteorological Association, NOAA, the Union of Concerned Scientists, and the Commonwealth Club of San Francisco, where he recently received the Stephen Schneider Award, etc. He's testified before Congress on numerous occasions. He's defended other climate scientists in their nomination process to the National Academy of Sciences. His list of peer-reviewed publications is 9 pages long, 140 at least, in major scientific peer-reviewed, important journals. He's contributed to at least 12 books and written dozens of stories for the public in publications like Scientific American about the value and beauty of science, where he has decried the war on science launched by the denial machine and especially, most recently, the Trump administration. His list of invited presentations is over 500, including, importantly, talks before the National Judicial College, which we may hear more about from Dr. Santer. And finally, in his CV, he lists his many daring alpine climbs in the US, Europe, and the Himalayas. And I hope he'll tell us about his near-death experience in a fall into a crevasse when he was a young climber, which taught him to fear no man. He got himself out himself of this crevasse and has been fearless ever since. It's not easy or pleasant to buck the system run by the fossil fuel industry, believe me. But Dr. Santer exemplifies what courage and dedication look like. So it's a great honor to have him here tonight. Welcome, my friend. Thank you, Dr. Santer. The floor is yours.
Unmute.
Can everyone see my screen?
Yes.
Great. Thank you, Peter, for that introduction. My most important distinction is that I'm your friend. So this is a new presentation for me. I've tried to put together some of the things that have happened in the last year that have been deeply concerning to me. And that's primarily what I'm going to talk to you about tonight. But before we get into concerning developments of the last year, let me just briefly recap one of the things that Peter mentioned. This arc of history, this arc of scientific understanding from 1990 through to the present. Why 1990? It was the first scientific assessment report of the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change. I was a pretty young greenhorn back then, but I participated in that first report of the IPCC, and our bottom line conclusion was the jury is still out. Back then in 1990, it was too early to tell whether there was or was not a human-caused global warming signal. Our conclusion was this: the unequivocal detection of the enhanced greenhouse effect from observations is not likely for a decade or more. 5 years later, in 1995, I was the convening lead author, as Peter mentioned, of Chapter 8 of the second IPCC assessment report. That chapter dealt with detection of climate change and attribution of causes. Our 12-word conclusion from that chapter is forever engraved on my memory. Quote, "The balance of evidence suggests a discernible human influence on global climate." And it was the first time that the international scientific community spoke with one voice and said, formally, we can see it. We can see a human-caused signal in the data. Humans are no longer innocent bystanders in the climate system. That was a momentous conclusion, but it was also one that profoundly changed my life. As Peter mentioned, a lot of powerful individuals, companies, even countries, think Saudi Arabia and Kuwait, did not like that finding. It was bad for business. They tried to destroy the finding and the science on which the discernible human influence finding was based, and they went after me personally. There were calls for my dismissal with prejudice from my position at Lawrence Livermore National Lab. I was investigated by Congress, by then Californian Congressman Dana Rohrabacher. The sources of my funding were investigated. It was rumored that I was going to be indicted by the Hague International Court of Justice for, quote, falsification of internationally relevant scientific documents, unquote. It was a bad time. The Wall Street Journal in June of 1996 published an op-ed by Frederick Seitz, a past president of the National Academy of Sciences, not a climate scientist, not someone who had been involved in the IPCC report in any way, shape, or form. Professor Seitz accused me in the Wall Street Journal of the worst abuse of the peer-reviewed system that he had seen in his 60 years as a scientist, and alleged that I had been responsible for political tampering with the IPCC's 1995 report. All of these allegations were false. It took me several years of my scientific career to set the record straight, and I learned a lot of valuable lessons in the process. The third assessment report which was led by different scientists, came to a much stronger and more definitive conclusion than our cautious, even wimpy, the balance of evidence suggests finding in 1995. The third report in 2001 tried to quantify the size of the human effect on climate. Look at that language there. Most of the warming observed over the last 50 years is attributable to human activities. The next report in 2007, the fourth IPCC assessment, introduced this likelihood language. It is very likely, greater than 90% probability that the statement is correct, that most of the global average temperature increase since the mid-20th century is on us, is due to human-caused greenhouse gas increases. The 2013 report upped the likelihood language and used extremely likely that human influence has been the dominant cause of observed warming since the mid-20th century. And the most recent sixth IPCC assessment used this extraordinary word, unequivocal. It is unequivocal that human influence, human fingerprints have been identified not only on the land surface, but in the atmosphere, in the ocean. They're everywhere we've looked. So that's the arc of scientific understanding. And I'm proud that I've been involved in every one of these assessments, all six of them. And through the science that I've done with my colleagues around the world, have helped in a small way to identify those human fingerprints on surface temperature, on atmospheric temperature, on the moisture content of the atmosphere, on atmospheric circulation patterns, on ocean heat content. We've showed over this span of time that the story the climate system is telling us is internally and physically consistent, and that's been powerful. Fast forward to today, where this story is being erased by the current administration. I'm going to tell you a little bit about what that erasure has looked like in the last year, and I'm going to focus on different categories of developments in climate science that have concerned me. One is the exiting important international treaties and agreements. Another is dismantling US scientific institutions. This is of great concern to me here, this third one, turning government organizations like the US Department of Energy, an entity that I worked for 3 decades, into platforms for science denial. I'm going to talk a little bit about the disappearing of data, the consigning of data to a deep memory hole. I'm going to talk about another issue that Peter mentioned, hampering judicial education, preventing climate scientists like me from educating judges about the science of climate change. And I'm going to talk a little bit about controlling language, preventing agencies from even using words like climate change. So let's start off with the first one, exiting international treaties and agreements. You may have heard relatively recently that the US pulled out of the Paris Climate Agreement for the second time. This was announced on the first day of the second Trump presidency. It came into effect, this removal of the US from the Paris Climate Agreement, just last month on January the 27th. What does it mean? It means that we're now the only country in the world to pull out of the global agreement among nations to try and fight climate change. We're on the outside looking in. And many of us, even many fossil fuel companies believed that this was the wrong decision to take. Better to be on the inside trying to negotiate with the rest of the world than being impotent, than being outside looking in. Another development, a more recent development, is pulling out of the UN Framework Convention on Climate Change. This too was announced on January the 27th, 2026. And this, like exiting the Paris Climate Agreement, leaves the US without a voice. We've been part of the UN Framework Convention on Climate Change, trying to negotiate greenhouse gas reductions with other countries. Now we're not. Dismantling scientific institutions. This is the National Center for Atmospheric Research, one of the crown jewels of the United States. It's in Boulder, Colorado. You see it here. A beautiful, beautiful set of buildings designed and built by I.M. Pei, the famous architect, blending into the red sandstone of the Front Range. And it's a place where many of the best and the brightest from the United States and from the world have studied, have done their research, have contributed to that arc of history that I showed you, that arc of scientific understanding. So there is now a threat, a serious threat from the Trump administration to dismantle this crown jewel of American climate science. This was announced on December the 16th, 2025. And the Trump administration wants to break up NCAR and possibly remove it from its buildings there that I just showed you, and also remove its computational capabilities that exist in Wyoming. This was announced by the head of OMB, also the chief architect of Project 2025, Russ Vogt. Here's what he said on Facebook, I believe. The National Science Foundation will be breaking up the National Center for Atmospheric Research, NCAR, in Boulder, Colorado. This facility is one of the largest sources of climate alarmism in the country. A comprehensive review is underway, and any vital activities, such as weather research, will be moved to another entity or location. It has been rumored that this decision to break up NCAR is political payback. You may remember that an ally of Donald Trump, Tina Peters, was indicted for interfering with voting machines in Colorado. President Trump pardoned her, but she has not been pardoned for the state crime that she committed and was convicted of in the state of Colorado. It has been stated that this decision to punish NCAR is a decision to punish the state of Colorado. Another scientific institution that has been in the crosshairs is this one here, the Goddard Institute for Space Studies. They leased a building where they've been for many, many decades, and the canceling of the Goddard lease for this building took effect on May the 31st, 2025. It's this iconic building, familiar to many of you, I think, from Seinfeld. This is Tom's Restaurant that you can see here on the bottom floor, where many Seinfeld scenes were filmed, and the Goddard Institute occupied the building above the restaurant there. The researchers have now been scattered to the wind after the cancellation of this lease. Here's one reaction I'd like to read to you. A NASA source requested anonymity due to fear of retribution told CNN that it will be more difficult for the lab to carry out its missions remotely, and the move is demoralizing for the workforce. In addition, the same scientists are waiting for the axe to fall on the mission of earth science at the agency, they told CNN. Another imperiled organization has been the Geophysical Fluid Dynamics Lab in Princeton. It was announced by Commerce Secretary Howard Lutnick on April the 8th, 2025, that the Geophysical Fluid Dynamics Lab and Princeton University have cooperative agreements to do climate research in a number of different areas, and those have now received severe funding cuts. The Department of Commerce announced that it would be ending approximately $4 million in funding for climate change research at Princeton related to climate risks. The announcement characterized the climate research at the university as narratives, not as research, as narratives, and said the programs were no longer in keeping with the Trump administration's priorities. Funding for these programs will end June 30th, 2025. Let's turn now to this issue, one that is very close to me and that I'm deeply concerned about: turning government organizations into platforms for science denial. That's been in the news just in the last week with the executive order of President Trump to rescind the endangerment finding. President Trump's Environmental Protection Organization rejected the bedrock scientific finding that greenhouse gases threaten human life and well-being, and the agency, the EPA, can no longer regulate greenhouse gases. The president and here the administrator of the EPA, Lee Zeldin, in their announcement on February 13th.
Sounds like it just started.
Sorry, someone, could you mute, please? Thank you. In the announcement on February the 13th, this was billed by the White House as the biggest regulatory relief in history. Recently, today, public health groups sued the EPA over the repeal of the endangerment finding. So the EPA, far from being the environmental protection organization or agency protecting our air and our water, has turned into an agency that is antithetical to protecting human health. Then there's the US Department of Energy, where, as Peter mentioned, I worked for 30 years. The Department of Energy released an official government report on June the 29th, 2025. Here it is. It was entitled "A Critical Review of Impacts of Greenhouse Gas Emissions on US Climate." This is from the foreword by Secretary of Energy Chris Wright. Here's what he wrote. "I've reviewed the report carefully, and I believe it faithfully represents the state of climate science today. Still, many readers may be surprised by its conclusions, which differ in important ways from the mainstream narrative." There's that word again, narrative. That's a sign of how far the public conversation has drifted from the science itself. So Secretary Wright is saying, I'm getting things back on track with this report. Science has drifted, and we're going to put it right. Pretty soon after the release of this DOE report, which was authored by 5 noted climate change skeptics, the report was scrutinized by dozens of scientists. Over 84 scientists, led by Professor Andrew Dessler at Texas A&M, University produced a 450-page report identifying errors in the DOE report. It turned out that, rather surprisingly to me, although this was an official Department of Energy report, the report team had not gone through Federal Advisory Committee procedures in order to be impaneled. It was illegal. They met in private. The authors of the report and Secretary Wright should have known that they were using an illegal process to produce this report, and they were sued. And a judge ruled that, yes, indeed, the process was illegal, but importantly, the illegally produced incorrect report is still out there on the Department of Energy website, accessible to the general public. It has not been pulled. This is from another organization, Carbon Brief. Many of you may be familiar with them. They're in the UK. They also did fact-checking, and I think it's fair to say that the Department of Energy Climate Working Group report was an embarrassment. It was riddled with errors. And I'm going to speak to you today about one of those errors that is very near and dear to me. A case study in errors, let's call it that. So I've spoken to CCL before about vertical fingerprinting. What does that mean? Vertical fingerprinting is an effort to use atmospheric temperature from the Earth's surface right up to 50 kilometers above the surface, the top of the stratosphere, to see whether those atmospheric temperature changes provide you with information about human effects on climate. I've spent 30 years of my career doing this. The first paper I published on this subject was in Nature in 1996. Here's what the DOE report said about that work. A combination of tropospheric warming and stratospheric cooling is a commonly cited fingerprint of anthropogenic climate change. Stratospheric warming since 2000 coincides with continued surface and tropospheric warming, a pattern that is not found in climate model simulations and is not apparently consistent with the anthropogenic fingerprint. This is in section 5 of the DOE report. And here are the key phrases: stratospheric warming since 2000. And this stratospheric warming since 2000 is not found in climate models and is not consistent with the anthropogenic fingerprint. Another thing that's important to note about this rather extraordinary claim, dismissing over 3 decades of mature scientific understanding, is it's not sourced. There was no figure showing stratospheric warming since 2000. There was no sourced, peer-reviewed paper showing that climate models fail after 2000 in the stratosphere. So let's look at this claim. It's important. It goes back to this gentleman, Suki Manabe, formerly at the Geophysical Fluid Dynamics Lab in Princeton, one of the labs that is now imperiled, as I mentioned earlier. Like Professor Klaus Hasselmann, whom Peter mentioned, Suki Manabe won part of the 2021 Nobel Physics Prize for his work on climate modeling. And in 1967, together with his colleague at the Geophysical Fluid Dynamics Lab, Dick Weatherald, Manabe produced and published one of the most famous papers in climate science. What did they do? They used a very simple model of the climate system. This is, back in the 1960s. And they performed a simple numerical simulation. In this simple climate model that looked at the properties of different kind of different kinds of greenhouse gases, carbon dioxide, methane. The model had convection and clouds and water vapor. And when they increased atmospheric CO2 from 150 to 300 to 600 parts per million, they saw this very curious behavior. Because of the increase in CO2, the lower atmosphere, the troposphere, more effectively trapped heat. Most of the CO2 that we release by fossil fuel burning goes into the troposphere. That's where 75% of the mass of the atmosphere is. And that means you more efficiently trap heat low down. And the upper atmosphere, as Manabe showed in this model calculation, the stratosphere cooled. And that cooling got larger the higher up you got above the Earth's surface. We were going from the surface to about 45 kilometers above it. This was a really interesting insight back then in 1967 because it was a prediction. We didn't have the satellite measurements of atmospheric temperature change to determine whether Manabe and Weatherald were right or not. They could have been wrong. We had some weather balloon data, but the weather balloons didn't have the structural integrity to get above about 20 to 25 kilometers. They burst, literally. So was Manabe right? What did the actual measurements show us subsequently? This is what they showed us. This is from a group in California, Remote Sensing Systems in Santa Rosa. They're one of the premier shops in the world for satellite microwave radiometry. What are you looking at here? This is a picture of temperature change through the atmosphere from the South Pole on the left to the North Pole on the right. And we're going from close to the surface to 45 to 50 kilometers above the surface. And these measurements are made by so-called microwave sounders on polar orbiting satellites. And these microwave sounders measure the microwave emissions from oxygen molecules. Those emissions depend on the temperature of different layers of the atmosphere. By measuring at different microwave frequencies, you can literally back out the temperature of the lower troposphere, the middle to upper troposphere, the lower stratosphere, and that's what you see here, right to the upper stratosphere up here. This is over 40 years, 1986, the beginning of the gap-free satellite record through to the end of 2025. So this is pretty much a real-time analysis of the vertical structure of atmospheric temperature change in the data. And it shows what Manabe and Weatherald predicted back in 1967. The lower atmosphere, the troposphere, has warmed and the stratosphere has cooled. Stratospheric cooling, again, as predicted by Manabe and Weatherald, gets larger the higher up you get into the stratosphere. In the troposphere, most of the warming, or the largest warming, is over the Arctic, where we've seen very large decreases in the extent of Arctic sea ice, over 40% since the beginning of the satellite era, and decreases in Arctic snow cover. Those are associated with positive amplifying feedbacks, those changes in bright, reflective snow and ice. And that's why the Arctic has been warming 4 times faster than the global average warming. The take-home message from this is Manabe and Weatherall were right. The data actually show what they predicted all that time ago. And the Manabe and Weatherall fingerprint that, again, was estimated from a very simple climate model back in 1967 is there in state-of-the-art present-day climate models, which is what you see here. Again, we're looking from the South Pole to the North Pole, and from the surface to nearly 50 kilometers above the surface. And what my colleagues and I have done here is we've calculated from climate model simulations with human-caused changes in greenhouse gases, synthetic satellite temperatures that enable us to make an apples-to-apples comparison with actual satellite data. And these sophisticated climate models, these are all models that participated in the sixth assessment report of the IPCC in 2021. They show this canonical Monabian Weatherald fingerprint of warming low down, cooling of the stratosphere in response to human-caused greenhouse gas increases. And here are the satellite data again from colleagues at Remote Sensing Systems in Santa Rosa. So why is the DOE report making the claim that it did? Let's go back to this. They're saying again that the stratosphere is warming since 2000. Okay, let's look at that. Here are stratospheric temperatures from 25 to 50 kilometers above the Earth's surface. The blue are satellite data. This is from a NOAA group at the University of Maryland. And the black line is the average of a number of different model simulations, the same 9 models that I just showed you in the previous slide. The gray lines, in case you are wondering, those are individual realizations, we call them, of these 9 models. There are over 32 gray lines there. You can run the same climate model many times from different initial conditions, and that's what each of those gray lines is there. So let's go to 2000. This is the time period referred to by the Department of Energy. And if you look at this, there is no stratospheric warming since 2000. In the middle to upper stratosphere, there is very large cooling. In some cases, nearly 2 degrees from 2000 through to the present. The DOE report is really focusing on the lower stratosphere, about 15 to 20 kilometers above the Earth's surface. And in that region, there has been little change from 2000 to the present. Why? There's been little change in the lower stratosphere because of something good that humanity did, the Montreal Protocol. So back in the 1970s and 80s, scientists recognized that the production of chlorofluorocarbons was depleting the ozone layer. Most ozone resides in the lower stratosphere, and by producing these ozone-depleting substances, we were destroying ozone. Ozone is a greenhouse gas. We were cooling the lower stratosphere. And people recognized, scientists and industry, that's a bad thing. The ozone layer protects us from harmful UVB radiation. If we destroy it, we have more cancer, really bad thing. And humanity got its act together, negotiated the Montreal Protocol to ban ozone-depleting substances, negotiated successor agreements and amendments. And guess what? Ozone started to recover because we banned ozone-depleting substances. And after 2000, you can see in ozone measurements that healing of the ozone layer. So lower stratospheric temperature is recovering too. And the amazing thing that you can see here is that when climate models in black are driven with the history of changes in ozone-depleting substances, they are in excellent agreement with the blue line, with the actual observations. Far from being an area where models and data disagree fundamentally, as the DOE report incorrectly claimed, this is a demonstration of model skill. If you give it the right changes over time in things like chlorofluorocarbons, you will get the right changes in ozone and you will get the right lower stratospheric temperatures. So the DOE report's claim that stratospheric warming since 2000 invalidates all vertical fingerprint studies is verifiably false. But that's only one example of misrepresentation of scientific understanding. I'll show you one second misrepresentation of mature scientific understanding. One claim made in the DOE report is that if you look at a small number of coastal US tide gauge stations, the claim in the DOE report is there's no evidence of acceleration in the rate of sea level rise. A former colleague of mine at Woods Hole Oceanographic Institution, Chris Pichuk, who, unlike the DOE report authors, actually studies sea level rise, published a paper just in December of 2025 where he addressed this claim. And here's what he found in a paper in AGU Advances. A recent report, the DOE report, argues that rates of coastal sea level rise in the US are not increasing. However, that report only considers a small subset of the available coastal sea level data from US tide gauges. Here, I instead use all of the available long-term records from US tide gauges, and I reach a dramatically different conclusion. I find that, on a nationwide average, rates of coastal sea level rise in the US have doubled in the past 125 years, and that present-day rates are well above the historical average. This represents conclusive evidence that coastal sea level in the US is accelerating, likely due to climate change. And there are many other pieces of supporting information. Satellite radar altimetry gives estimates of a global increase in the rate of sea level rise since the beginning of satellite measurements in 1988. This stuff matters. This is important. Dismissing scientific understanding by non-experts is harmful, and putting that out in an official government report is harmful. And the report is still out there, as I mentioned, uncorrected. Anyone can download it. Disappearing data. So many of you may be aware that Earth observations are imperiled now. The proposed cuts to NASA's Science Mission Directorate are severe. The Planetary Society warned that this would deliver an extinction-level event to NASA's science efforts, particularly in terms of figuring out how and why climate is changing on Earth. Also, on the subject of disappearing data, you may have read about the EPA. It previously, under the Biden administration, had a quite good public explainer about the different human and natural effects on climate. The human effects have been removed. So all that's discussed is natural causes of climate change. Another thing that's deeply concerning is the orbiting carbon observatory that has helped us to figure out where there are emissions of carbon dioxide and methane, for example, from leaky pipelines. There's no money for OCO. Those observations are convenient, and it is astonishing to essentially adopt a strategy of closing your eyes, saying, we don't want to know. We don't want to know anything about where emissions are, how much their emissions of greenhouse gases we're producing, transport of emissions from other countries to the United States. We don't want to know anymore. Hampering judicial education. So this is another very recent development here. Just a few weeks ago, the so-called Reference Manual on Scientific Evidence that the courts receive to guide them on how complex scientific information, say DNA evidence or cyber evidence or climate science evidence, how that evidence should be introduced in a court of law. One chapter of this report was a climate science chapter. Recently, Republican attorney generals objected to the climate science chapter and asked the Federal Judicial Center to remove the climate science chapter from the reference manual on scientific evidence that goes to all judges. And that chapter has now been removed. In the letter from the Republican attorneys general to the head of the Federal Judicial Center, guess what they cited as evidence that the climate chapter was biased in the reference manual on scientific evidence? Yes, they cited the DOE report. So the deeply flawed DOE report is being held up as evidence that mainstream science is flawed. It's heartbreaking. I think that's the only word that adequately captures my sense of outrage that a report that has been so discredited, the DOE Climate Working Group report, is being used to alter reference manuals on scientific evidence. In a new attack on the science of climate change, a federal agency, again, the Federal Judicial Center, has stripped a chapter on global warming from a manual written to help judges understand important scientific questions they may face in their courtrooms. We don't want to have an educated judiciary. This gentleman here, Leonard Leo, who was responsible for helping and advising President Trump under the first Trump administration in terms of Supreme Court picks, has been leading these efforts to prevent climate scientists from educating judges. And unfortunately for me, I have now some personal knowledge of this issue. I was asked in early 2021 by the National Academy of Sciences to brief judges as part of a discussion of this reference manual on scientific evidence. I spoke about fingerprint evidence for human effects on climate and how we use fingerprint techniques to disentangle human and natural effects on climate. I spoke about satellite data, and very, very powerful actors did not like the fact that I spoke to judges at the invitation of the National Academy. I was outed by an organization called Power the Future as a, quote, serial presenter on climate change because I gave multiple presentations to judges. So not a serial criminal or a serial rapist, but a serial presenter. When Fox News asked me for my commentary on being outed as a serial presenter, this is what I said, that my job is to improve scientific and public understanding of the nature, causes, and impacts of climate change, and that as of today, U.S. climate scientists still have the freedom to educate U.S. citizens on the reality and seriousness of climate change. I cherish that freedom. While it still exists, I intend to continue serving as a serial presenter on climate science. Controlling language, finally here. These are all words that have been banned by my former employer, the U.S. Department of Energy, in public-facing comments. Climate change, emissions, decarbonization, energy transition, sustainability, dirty energy, green, clean energy, carbon and CO2 footprint. So that's 1984 territory. That really is deeply, deeply concerning, that words that describe reality, the climate is changing, can no longer be used by, say, Lawrence Livermore National Lab employees to communicate with um, with the public. Another concerning way in which language is being used is this criminalization of climate science. At his speech to the UN General Assembly back in the fall of 2025, President Trump used the words con job, that climate change is the greatest con job perpetrated on humanity by stupid people. And when you use this sort of incendiary language again and again and again, con job, hoax, conspiracy, you change the narrative. You get people to believe, well, if the president is saying this, there must be something to it. Maybe all of these climate scientists are a part of a cabal to alter world systems of government, to get rich quick, to do something. All of this is really, really deeply concerning. So what do we do about it? Here's my personal strategy. I'm almost finished here, for pushing back against these powerful forces of unreason. One powerful way is by continuing to do the science. I'll give you an example of that. So last year, we published a paper in Proceedings of the National Academy of Sciences where we did a simple thought experiment and asked, when might humans have first identified a fingerprint on atmospheric temperature? And we used climate model simulations that started back in 1860 in order to address this question, and applied fingerprint methods to those simulations to figure out when could we have known. And the very surprising answer is we could have known pretty quickly if we had been able to measure temperature in the stratosphere. Because the signal of human-caused cooling, the very signal predicted by Manabe and Weatherald, is so large up there, and the noise is so low. We could have known by about 1885, before the advent of gas-powered cars. I'm proud of that. I'm proud of the fact that I achieved computational autonomy. I recognized that my ability to access Department of Energy computers and continue doing work was going to go away, and that I needed to be able to do science on my laptop. And that's the same laptop that I used to do this analysis here. It's critically important to keep the embers of science burning, to keep doing science, even in these challenging circumstances. Join with others. What do I mean by that? I'm a member of the National Academy of Sciences, and many of us in the academies, not only of science, but engineering and medicine as well, are deeply, deeply concerned about everything that I just mentioned here in the last half hour or so. We joined together in a grassroots effort and wrote a letter that we released to the media. And here is some reporting on that. Nearly 2,000 leading American scientists, including dozens of Nobel Prize winners, have issued a stark warning that the US lead in science is being decimated by the Trump administration's cuts to research and a growing climate of fear that jeopardizes independent research. This was an open letter, and it was, excuse me, could you mute yourself, someone out there? Thanks. And that finding like-minded individuals who are willing to use their voices, that's one way of pushing back. Writing essays. I have tried not just to advance the science, but also translate science into plain English. I've written, particularly in the last year, a number of essays for the Bulletin of the Atomic Scientists, This is about the proposed dismantling of the National Center for Atmospheric Research. I've written for Scientific American, and I'm going to continue to do that because if we can't communicate the fierce urgency of now, the reality and seriousness of climate change to the public and to policymakers, we lose. It's critically important to speak and listen to students. They're the future. So I've spent a lot of time in the last year trying to go to university campuses and not only to speak about science and the importance of keeping the embers burning and alive, but also to listen to students' concerns. I want to understand, what do they think about this? Will they give up? Are they motivated to continue? How can I help them? How can I try and give them the opportunities that I had as a student? I'm going to continue to do that. Find new communication channels. So, in addition to doing the science and writing about the science, I've been fortunate to interact with playwrights. This was from the play Kyoto, written by Joe Murphy and Joe Robertson. And it's about the Kyoto Protocol that was agreed upon in December 1997 in Kyoto, Japan, the first international agreement to limit the emissions of greenhouse gases. And the statement that I mentioned right at the beginning, that 12-word statement, the balance of evidence suggests a discernible human influence on global climate, paved the way for the Kyoto Protocol. And the genesis of that 12-word finding is part of the play. So here, I had the extraordinary opportunity to be on stage at the Lincoln Center speaking to myself. So that's me with a microphone, and the guy to the left of me is the character who plays Ben Santer in the play. The two playwrights are also there, the two Joes, and our moderator. I mention this because a play reaches audiences I could not hope to reach through the scientific papers I write and through IPCC reports and through essays. Another mechanism for reaching new audiences was this play, a radio play from BBC4, Smoking Guns, that also covers what happened in the genesis of those infamous 12 words. The balance of evidence suggests a discernible human influence on global climate. So that's been another powerful lesson learned. Partner, figure out how to tell your story with people who are storytellers. Declare your values. What do I mean by that? In all of my public presentations, I tell people that I'm not just a scientist, I'm also a human being. And as Peter mentioned, I'm a climber. And I show them these kinds of pictures that I've taken during my 50 years as a climber and a mountaineer in beautiful, fragile, high alpine environments around the world. And I tell them that these places have value for me. They have meaning. If we lose them, and we are losing them rapidly, then that's not just a science issue. That's a larger issue about what we lose as human beings when we lose these beautiful, fragile places. Let's have a conversation about that too, not just about the science and the economics. And just finally, support organizations that are brave and effective. And there are some out there. The Union of Concerned Scientists, for example, Environmental Defense Fund. These are organizations that have now sued the Trump administration, as I mentioned earlier, both over the DOE report and now over the rescinding of the endangerment finding. They're putting a lot on the line by suing the administration for, in the DOE report's case, an illegally constituted and impaneled team of lead authors. So find organizations that are brave and effective. And I'm proud that I'm on the board of directors of the Union of Concerned Scientists. I should declare that here. And I'm proud to serve on the board of directors because I think they do good in the world. I took this picture about a month ago when I gave a lecture at the University of California at Santa Cruz. I was driving down from Half Moon Bay, this beautiful sunset, and I show it here because I'm not going off into the sunset. I'm not going to go and retire and have fun and just stop doing what I'm doing. I need to continue working to try and make this world a better place and try and ensure that we make decisions on how to address climate change based on the best available scientific information, not the DOE report. And what I've recognized is that we won't have sound science without a healthy democracy. So I've spoken out recently, not only as a scientist and concerns about things like the DOE report, but I've also spoken about the erosion of our democracy. Without democracy, we won't have sound science. Thank you very much. Sorry I went on a little bit long. I'm happy to answer any questions you might have.
Wow. Let me grab another tissue. Thank you so much, Dr. Santer. Uh, I'm almost speechless here. Um,
Yeah,
that was a fabulous presentation, Ben.
it wasn't fun to put this together because there are a lot of harms there, and they're all concerning. Some of them, like the DOE report. What do you do with that?